Hello, and welcome to the first podcast from the Trauma Informed Placemaking Project. We're really excited about opening up conversations in this area, and we thought we should let you know where we're coming from as the leads on the book. And I'm going to hand over to Cara for anything she has to say.
So we're going to spend this time today to talk about our thinking on trauma-informed placemaking, where it came from, and kind of what our concerns with it are as well, and what got us towards this project. So I'm going to jump in straight to some of those questions and those thoughts. So Anita, let's start with like the really obvious one. What is trauma-informed placemaking?
I think really it's such a broad spectrum of practices. Everything happens somewhere. As a species, we are wired for security. So I feel that those two factors really begin to look at what placemaking is, how we construct these places, what it could be, but really bringing in an awareness of how we operate generally as a species with our fight, flight, freeze, but also how the places that we make can both heal and cause trauma. And if we as practitioners are working with constructing those places, we really need to have a trauma-informed or trauma-aware approach.
I really agree. I think one of the things that got me thinking about bringing a trauma or the need for a trauma awareness in place was, I think, particularly some of the practices of placemaking that I was seeing in London and working with artists in sites of development, redevelopment, regeneration, but actually the politics behind it and very much in front of you is sites of really actually quite wholesale social cleansing. And there is no way that you could be in that place and not feel and see and speak about just the trauma that it was causing. And that was one of the first things that got me thinking about the practice of placemaking and its relationship to trauma, in that, or, bringing in that trauma kind of lens to the work that we're doing and thinking, actually, hold on a minute. Every place that we work with in some way is going to have this, historic or contemporary or future. You can see the trauma coming at you, thinking particularly of climate on that one. And yeah, we need to be bringing this into our ethics, and we need to be bringing some of this language and this practice into what we call our placemaking practice.
Yeah, and I think just touching on that, as an artist myself that had worked in London within community engagement, activism, education, I could see how practices were often conscripted into, and a lot of artists were engaged in these processes. And I personally began to really question, development, regeneration. A lot of the agendas, it always seemed to be trying to attract an external in. And what I was really interested in and looked at working towards was make it the best that it can be for the people who are already there, the other organisms already there, and everything else would flow. So it seemed that a lot of the things that pushed and developed placemaking weren't necessarily engaging with that very human and non-human piece. There was a lot of other agendas.
Yeah.
And that leads that's a professional perspective. That leads kind of into, you mentioned at the beginning about, starting the project and where we were coming from. So I want to, if you feel comfortable, ask you about, on a personal level, what does trauma in place mean for you, or what maybe has it historically meant for you that has given you these insights or an awareness?
Yeah, we spoke, didn't we? We spoke a lot in lockdown around the
Mm.
experience of COVID and Black Lives Matter and seeing trauma happen, right in front of us, albeit from behind our screens or from our windows looking out onto the world sort of thing. But, in those conversations, I actually could see a route plotted much further back into my life of a traumatic experience of place. I grew up in a really isolated and really, um, an isolated rural area in the UK. And in broad, blunt terms, you either owned the land or you worked the land. You didn't do both. And I grew up in the late 70s and in the 80s, where the economic policies being enacted upon that agriculture and that agricultural economy, I wasn't in a place that really had any tourism to speak of. But I saw the destruction of that around me. And I saw it destroy social fabric. I saw it destroy, a whole scale economy, but also people's family and personal economies as well. Um, and I was also seeing that in tandem with the miners' strikes that were happening at the same time. And this was all, although obviously in my 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old brain, I didn't get this, but this was all a really in place, experience of trauma. And I go back to those places and I speak to other people from those same rural experiences actually across the world. But, there's a long shadow of that. And, certain experience of poverty, PTSD and things like that are coming into this. And it's, generations of families lost their their livelihoods and their own sense of place and identity through that as well. And then I also grew up through the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s, and my father died of HIV/AIDS and variant CJD, and we experienced um, we experienced a lot of prejudice in the streets that we called our town, our home, but also then directly levied onto our home as well, and feelings of not feeling safe within your home. And again, it's that traumatic experience of place and everything that I thought was safe not being, or everything I needed to be safe, feeling really actually quite impinged upon and feeling very vulnerable in that space as well. So yeah, that for me, sort of tracking back through my life, that's where I can see, some of the dots joining for me. But yeah, from that very personal perspective, that's how, my understanding of a trauma experience of place. What about you?
Well, I think, there's a lot of, even though maybe the specifics of the situation might be different, there's a lot in what you say that I feel really resonated with. I grew up in Northern Ireland in the 70s.
Mm.
And most of my childhood and adolescence was pre the first ceasefire, not even the peace agreement. And I think it wasn't, like you say, when you're a child, you feel insecure. You have that emotional response to a
Mm.
traumatic situation, even if you really don't understand the nuances and the hows and the whys. And I think, and this kind of, it shocks me, but it also, I think, is a really good illustration of trauma and coping mechanisms. And I remember being in London, 88, 89, maybe a bit later, and seeing a decommissioned army vehicle in and around Soho Square.
Mm.
And everybody is looking and pointing, going, look, look. And I'm
Mm.
looking and seeing nothing. Because what they were all pointing at as shocking, and that was my norm. I had become so accustomed to, well, what's
Mm.
unusual, what's extraordinary. And I think that was really at age 18, 19, when I first started really going, wow, my childhood experience was not normal. But it becomes not only normalized, you mentioned about economic policies, and we touched a little bit in the first place about policies and other agendas that were driving placemaking. I began to realize that I grew up in an area where the place itself was constructed to maintain a dominant majority.
Completely. And there was a story you said once as well about going into a shop in the UK and just holding your bag open because you expected your bag to be to be searched. And that really brought it home to me just how different, whilst yeah, some similarities, there is a kind of I feel your situation is much more kind of extreme in some sense compared to me growing up. Our
Mm,
shops were shutting down for sure. Like we were lucky if we had a shop to go into, but I also didn't have to show my bag when I entered into that shop.
yeah,
But of course, it speaks to this massive surveillance and policing of you and of Belfast. And yeah, this huge narrative that was riding over everything that you were doing.
I think on something that just I remember feeling, because at that time, at one point in Northern Ireland, 90% of people lived in all Catholic or all Protestant areas.
Mm.
So there was a segregation. The schools were segregated. What that meant was the most political question, in a way, the most loaded question you could ask someone, which is a very simple question, is where are you from?
Mm.
Because as soon as you said where you were from, there was a whole load of baggage of assumption that came with that that could actually be dangerous if
Yeah,
depending on who you said that to. And I began to look at, hang on a minute, who's making this place? Who's making these decisions? I was very lucky in as much as I grew up in an area where there was 12 kids in the street, 8 were Catholic, 4 were Protestant. My mum was one of the early peace women. My dad was a trade union person. And the message I got from a very young age was, if you poke someone in the eye, it's going to hurt. It doesn't
mm.
matter whether it's a Catholic eye or a Protestant eye. So I grew up, luckily, with a very leveling and understanding of there should be equity. I also saw how fear was manipulated.
Mm.
And I think, there's loads I could talk about in this space, but I think when I look back at the work that brought me into placemaking and what I hoped that I could begin to address was this idea of who are you to tell anyone? Why should there be a policy or legislation or whatever it is to say, I can have this friend, I can have this job, I can have this sense of security walking down the
Yeah,
street, or not,
yeah,
depending on, that was for me really, consolidating and, you know, trauma informed. I didn't even know those words. I mean, I knew there was those words, but at that point in my life, like you say, you're aware that something's not right.
yeah,
It's not equitable. There's better ways of doing things, but you don't have a language for it. You don't have a name for it, and you're trying to muddle your way through.
yeah,
You
completely.
know.
Let's 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 turn to the textbook. So
Mm,
we had our conversations during lockdown, thinking about trauma informed from the urgencies that we were seeing of everything that was going on in 2020.
mhm.
And we put a call out. Who else is doing this? lots of people responded. And now, as we're recording this, we're building the manuscript of a trauma-informed placemaking textbook that's going to be published with Routledge. So we've got our eyes, this real privileged look over this great writing that's coming in. What are some of your reflections and what's standing out to you at the moment with what we've been seeing so far?
Mm. I think going back to when we first put out the call, and I know I've said this, but we did expect to get, our 12 chapters maybe for a slim volume. I think in terms of what we got back, I think there was about 80 abstracts initially.
It was something like
It's
that,
huge, it's
yeah.
huge. So initially I was struck by, wow, people are really connecting to this. Um, and this is important. And not only were they connecting, they had been doing this work for a very long time. What that meant, and I think in terms of that, the two things that really stood out was one, a lot of what was coming back was really, here's what we've been doing, here's why we've been doing it, here's what we've learned.
Yeah.
Here's what we'd like to share. It was very practical, very concrete, things that could be shared with others that could begin to build maybe a toolbox, because one of the things I think with trauma is it can be very hard. You're in it, it's happening, you're triggered, you're responding before maybe you're even aware. So we need to be able to regulate. I think the other side of it was, and we really did a broad call. We weren't just calling in our own track, was how many proposals came from the arts and a real shift into quite a different form of socially engaged practice.
Yeah.
It was very driven, it was applied, it was really trying to question itself about best practice, about how not to make it worse. And I think the other little piece for that was most of it was coming, as we've talked about, from insights that maybe started very early in life.
Yeah.
Experiences that had set up a questioning, really, of,
You can see that. I think knowing you can kind of see that in our own trajectory about what brought us to working in place in the first place, and why we both also work with the arts so strongly through our place-based work, or started from an arts track in our studies and early careers as well. But something that really struck me is you can see that kind of same trajectory in the chapters in those that are writing it, because so many of them are writing from the first person. And I don't know why, but it didn't cross my mind that people would write from the first person. But they have, a number of them have, and it is such compelling and vital testimony that we've got here to, almost like bearing witness to that life trajectory from them, and bearing witness to the various different knowledges that they have that are bringing into this as well, and their practices, and how for some of them they have been naming their practice really explicitly as trauma informed, and for others actually this is like, okay, trauma informed, that's helping me make sense of something which I have been doing and been doing for a while. But that first person narrative of people talking about their experience of trauma in place from all sorts of intersectional and contemporary and historical perspectives is so incredibly powerful. But I think, and kind of, also, sharing that is no small thing to do as a writer. Putting that out there in the world is no small thing. But good God, credit to them as well, because so many of them have also given us something that I think for the reader can help them make sense of their own experience, but also from what they're reading, they know they're being shown, they're being guided and sort of nudged along the way on how to apply that into their own work as well. So, the chapters are gifts, really. But that first person voice is just so compelling to read. It's been, just, breathtaking, literally breathtaking in places, hasn't it? To read
There's
some of that testimony.
I've cried.
Yeah.
I'm not ashamed. I have cried because of the writing is not only so compelling, it's so honest, but beautifully present expressed
Yeah.
in its vulnerability, in its pain. I think the human connection, I think the empathy and the ability to connect, which I feel is something really critical for placemaking.
Mm,
With a lot of the political, the economic agendas, or the planning, or the regulations, there is a disconnect that often happens in
mm,
placemaking. The people in place almost become superfluous, like, oh, look, there's a tree in the way of a footpath, let's cut it down. Oh,
mm.
look, there's a community in the way of, let's move it out.
Yeah.
And I think for me as a textbook, what I love about the breadth of work and the approaches and the voices is it's also portraying, sometimes you read a lot of academic texts and they might excite you and great ideas, you might have to read them 3 or 4 times. This feels so accessible, so vital,
Mm,
which I think is something that we need to be mindful of in placemaking. It is not an abstract objective. These are people's lives, these are
yeah.
communities, these are histories, her stories, we stories,
Mm,
and I think in terms of foundationally, particularly as well for going forward, there's fantastic insights in this book that may not be, you can't just transfer them as is,
yeah.
because their context, they've come out of a particular process and situation and experience. But I think it's a really I feel it's a different sort of textbook.
I agree, but something I want to, before we kind of move on through the
Mm.
conversation, there's also something I think that's worth capturing here as well, that whilst there is a lot of vulnerability in this book and people are being vulnerable in their writing in this, there's also real boldness in it as
Mm.
well, and some statements there of like, don't do that.
Yeah,
That practice isn't good enough.
yeah,
We need to be doing this instead.
yeah.
There's a lot of that kind of real powerful statement and a
Mm.
real kind of call to action actually
Hmm.
for placemaking right now. Um, so yeah, I think there is something different here as a textbook for
Yeah.
sure. Um, yeah, I can't wait to get it out in the world and see what people's responses are
Mm.
to it.
And I think that touches that vulnerability. We often think of that as oh, we have to be strong, we have to be,
Mm,
but actually, to me, the book and the chapters are affirming the ability to be vulnerable and hold that knowledge and simultaneously be strong and act to affect change.
yeah,
That vulnerability and strength, I think that's something that hasn't been engaged with.
yeah,
And within placemaking, coming back to what I was saying, it's not this objective, abstract.
mm,
We are human.
mm,
We have emotions. We have,
mm,
and I think where you see the negative impact, say perhaps to others from a trauma response, is when it hasn't been dealt with, or because it's too painful, or it's been ignored, and then there is fallout.
Yeah,
There is damage because people are acting from a damaged, wounded
yeah,
position. So I think that that tension between the vulnerability and the strength is actually a critical piece
yeah, I agree.
of a trauma informed approach. Being aware, here's how we operate, here's what it feels like. I have to be mindful to not trigger that, and that's a big, it's big. It's a
And
lot to think
yeah,
about.
it's no small piece, and it's complex. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it is
Hmm.
complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that leads quite nicely to our next question. I mean, as placemakers, this is a textbook. There's a reason for that. And I guess, the thing would be what do placemakers need to know about trauma? What are the critical pieces?
I think it's probably important in this stage to say we're not expecting every placemaker to go and get a clinical qualification in trauma informed practice or anything like that. But we are asking for that awareness to come in. And there are some tools in that, obviously, which are
Yeah.
useful. I think, though, the first step for me, what's really critical for placemakers to know about trauma is to have the awareness that we can cause the trauma. There's such a positivist sort of spin put around placemaking,
Mm,
but we know it's complex and contested and really political ground that we step into as placemakers. But our practices, whilst going in and having awareness of historical contemporary trauma, great, brilliant. But our practices as placemakers can cause the trauma as well. Who we talk to, how we talk to them, who we don't talk to, and how we don't talk to them in that sense, they are really they are potential sites of trauma as well. So I think we have to hold ourselves accountable, I think, to ethics that have that trauma awareness so that we are not the ones causing that,
hmm.
but we are critically and constructively useful in that healing process that comes out the other side, the flip side of the coin of the trauma being the healing.
Yeah.
It's really contested, and I'm aware that I'm saying that in quite broad terms, but I think, yeah, if placemakers need to know anything about trauma, for me, it's that our practices, our processes, who include and exclude actively, subjectively, all of it, those are all possible sites of trauma.
Yeah. And I think that awareness goes a long way.
I think it does.
Not once you are aware, I think, and you can't just have awareness on its own.
Mm.
Once you are aware, then I do feel as a professional, there is a duty of care. There
Yeah, I
is,
think it changes like your intentionality and like your disposition in place once with you when you have that trauma awareness. I think it's almost impossible to not act from that kind of intentionality, to act from that kind of, disposition in what you're doing. Sorry, I
yeah.
jumped in, Anita, I'm sorry.
No, no, I think that's really important because I think with the awareness and the intention front and center, it helps you as a practitioner to be more accountable.
Mm,
If you're not aware or you don't have an intention of do no harm, inadvertently you could end up doing
yeah,
harm.
yeah.
We have often heard of the well-intentioned but deeply misplaced and dangerous.
Yeah, the do bad or the do gooder. Yeah.
And I think I think it's something to be aware of. I also think it does take a lot of courage because we know that in other areas we are so because we're wired for security, we are often so afraid to get it wrong
Yeah.
that we maybe don't try or we maybe don't ask for help or look to see. oh, I'm not sure. Is it okay to ask? Because I
Yeah.
think sometimes as a professional, there's an expectation that you know everything.
Mm.
Uh,
But even, you know, a sort of self-imposed expectation
mm,
as well that you know everything, and of course you don't, and thinking you know everything leads to assumptions, which is the root of such awful dramatic practice. Yeah,
yeah,
so I think we're probably just as guilty as thinking that we know everything, you know, as much as people put that perception onto us as well. We collude with it.
yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, the vulnerability again,
Yeah,
accepting from the get-go, you do not. You know, they
yeah,
talk about knowing the importance of knowing what you don't know.
yeah.
And I think that's a piece. I also think, you know, as you said, there's no expectation about, you know, getting a social work or a therapeutic or a clinical background or qualification. I think it is about being aware and being informed.
Mm,
I think, and also, you know, there's a bit of a consensus around guiding principles,
mm.
you know,
Trauma
safety first.
informed guiding
Yes,
principles. Yeah,
trauma-informed guiding principles. Safety first.
yeah,
You know, if we understand that trauma is triggered through insecurity and then our body goes into a process of which we don't have much control unless we have, you know, processed and been able to regulate it. I think that's, you know, how can I be safe for myself? How can I be safe for others? What are the areas of danger? You
mm,
know, I think very human trustworthiness, being
yeah.
transparent. We all know that within placemaking historically, there have often been other agendas. I think that's really important. Peer support, support for practitioners, for support for communities, um, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment. I always find an interesting word. I don't really feel you can empower others. You can support and
Yeah, I
and
struggle with that word as well because I can't empower everybody. I might be able to help set up the conditions for something to happen in that kind of way, but it's not for
yeah,
me to empower.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. But I think creating those conditions for multiple voices, multiple
Mm.
stories, um, choice and decision making. I mean, we often talk about how relevant Ornstein's ladder of
Yeah,
participation from
I
1968,
know.
how we're still seeing the
Yeah,
low levels of the rungs of the ladder in action and kind of,
yeah.
you know, um, I think as well that we've talked about first person experience, we've talked about that knowledge that comes through process.
Mm,
I think to recognize what others are bringing to the table, who
mm.
may or may not consider themselves as professionals. You know,
I agree. Yeah, and I think, you know, placemaking for me, it always, when I was introduced to it, was such a radical practice because
mm,
actually at the core of it and what its real mission was around that placemaking table were a huge number of not the usual stakeholders in a project. And I
mm,
think some of that, you know, that's been lost or co-opted in some ways along the way, but that's the real power of placemaking and those 6 steps. You put those two things together. And again, that's such a radically powerful practice that we've got
yeah.
there.
And I
Does this
think,
bring us on to the next, to sort of the
yes,
next consideration? And what should, what are we kind of, what are we asking placemaking or these place-based practices? What are we asking them to be doing with this trauma awareness?
mm. I mean, I think where we were there is a nice lead in because, for example, the multiple voices,
Mm,
the understanding from different perspectives and stories, I feel really strongly we have to be working in collaboration. We have to be working with others. You know, we talked about we're not expecting people to have clinical backgrounds or to be psychotherapists, but recognize that there may be times where that knowledge, that voice, that profession has to be in the room.
Yeah.
You know, to not blindly go into a situation, as I said, the safety, that is dangerous for self or others.
Mm.
I think the big really thing is informing ourselves,
Mm.
you know, informing ourselves that this is a thing, it is very real, here's how it can operate. You may not even know, because one of the things increasingly in the more biochemical and physiological sphere they're recognizing is that the epigenetics, the
Yeah.
passing down of trauma, both within the cells as well as conditioned
Mm.
because of context that people are growing up in. I think really understanding how trauma can operate. It is very, it can be very nuanced. It doesn't have to be the big T trauma.
Yeah.
As we are wired for security, anything that makes us feel insecure can begin to trigger. And that often, when that trigger happens, you are no longer in the present.
Mm.
You are right back where the
Mm.
trauma happened. So that could mean, you know, you could be in a situation where, you know, in a discussion where the temperature's rising, it's becoming more incendiary, it's becoming, but going in knowing that could happen
Yeah.
and understanding and maybe even having a few tools to you know, de-escalate. Or I think these are very real. So it's about informing, it's about getting knowledge, getting tools, bringing that awareness into your practice in a practical way and collaborating. And I think the last thing I feel, and you know, I feel very strongly about this, you know, we are in a climate emergency.
Mm.
Suddenly, and of course, it's going to affect certain groups of people than others. But the bigger thing is, this is an existential
Yeah.
emergency, which means we are all going to be facing.
Mm.
And I think it's really important to begin to understand perhaps how we as practitioners can contribute positively and support and build networks and frameworks and tools that we will really need for the adaptation that's coming. Because
Yeah,
once,
and find the solutions for it as well.
yeah, I mean, I feel the solutions are more a case of how we can adapt. We're not fixing this. You know, we've gone too far down that path. I think my thing with solutions or how we can adapt will be once we move into that trauma spot response and collectively en masse,
Yeah.
if frontal cortex goes offline, we're not able to actually
Yeah.
solve problems. We're barely able to weigh up the consequences of our actions, which is often when you see acting out or fear-based
Mm.
responses. And I
Mm.
think, you know, I know certainly growing up in Northern Ireland, coming almost full circle, I now look at a lot of what happens there as linked very much to people feeling and it's not right because their dominance was malconstructed,
Mm.
but they are people and they have fears and their fears now. And we know if you're a fighter, when your fear response is triggered, you will fight.
Yeah.
And that's, I think this is where I feel there'll be a lot of work in equity and reconciliation practices and
Mm.
processes, trying to create other ways of doing things to really support us in this adaptation.
Yeah. Your
And
mention of, sorry, Anita, your
oh, I was
mention
just,
of tools there made me think that we should give a shout out, obviously, to artists and art processes as those that are working in that social engagement, and those, you know, think about like the long history of arts and community arts and community development spaces, of being able to hold spaces where you can talk across difference, where contention will arise, but it doesn't have to escalate. You know, the tools are out there. There are the skilled practitioners to bring into spaces for those types of conversations. So I think for me, I'm always sort of calling for the arts to be seen as part of placemaking for those reasons, not necessarily just ostensibly the creative process or the creative outcome
Mhm.
at the end of it as well.
Mm.
And for me, it always, what I would want, what I want anybody working in place to do with this trauma awareness, it comes back to that self-awareness in your own practice, to be self-aware of what practice you're putting out into the world, the intentions that you're putting into your practice, how you're holding yourself accountable, how you're critiquing your own practice, who you're having those types of conversations with. And I think this also, for me, also builds towards that placemaking does work in the space of working towards spatial justice,
Mm.
an intersectional but spatial justice.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the human in that, and there's the non-human in that. So the climate justice as well is a major component of this as a trauma-informed approach. And I look out and the world is either burning or flooding around us.
Mm.
We are not going to meet the targets that we had. I live in the UK, and I don't even want to go into that, but it's not, it's no longer about what will happen, it's about what is happening.
Mm.
And so this trauma-informed approach for me as a placemaker is absolutely essential to inform my practice today, not just what I will do tomorrow, but absolutely what I'm doing today.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things, because I was thinking about, and I keep going back to this, it was interesting, I kept questioning, was it the channels we were putting out the call? Was it why there was so many contributors coming from the broad scope of the arts? And I think part of that was it was process.
Mm,
It's about making sense, trying to make sense when maybe things don't make sense. I also felt, and I looked at this as part of my own research, there is over half a century of artists leaving the gallery, leaving
yeah,
behind their practices, working at the front line,
yeah,
in communities, being challenged, being called out, and this comes back to that vulnerability and strength, the willingness to go there,
yeah,
the willingness to not only critique ourselves, but allow and accept others' critique
mm,
of us, and use that as an opportunity to grow and
yeah,
change and question what we're doing and how we're doing it, and can we make it better, and asking, what am I doing wrong?
yeah, completely,
you
completely.
know, and I think, in my own looking at arts for social and environmental positive impact over that half century, I could see over and over there were so many tools and techniques that had really evolved through doing, through
Mm,
being in process with
mm,
self and other, through that growth that we talked about, sometimes being called out,
mm,
whatever. And yet a lot of these were overlooked. I sit in a lot of forums and networks and research networks all around climate, and I get quite frustrated about, oh, we need to raise awareness, awareness, awareness. And it's like, we've had 30 years of knowing
mm,
and we've done nothing. Awareness does not, in and of itself,
mm,
affect and this is where I think the spatial justice, the social, the environmental justice are intersectional in terms of the trauma-informed approach. Maybe we have an opportunity to look at this differently. What if our responses and reactions, whether it's within contested spaces or facing a challenge, really was grounded in our fact that we feel insecure, we
mm.
feel we don't belong, we feel maybe that lends another way of dealing with some of these other big challenges.
There's also something that isn't there for practitioners, though, for us as placemakers to go, actually, I feel insecure about going into a space with this.
Yeah.
And actually that is when the power of a network does come together, and as a kind of community of practice or a community of praxis, that we can help each other think through this. and we can
Hmm.
help each other think through and then step into action on this as well.
Yeah, and I think that's back to the collaboration piece,
Mm,
and the support, the peer support, the network. Ask questions because there's usually someone who's experienced something or has an experience that it may not be the answer because we no longer have
mm,
the answers. We're looking at what's the situation, what's the context, what's the history, what's the politics, what's the economics, what's the justice or lack of justice. As you said, it's complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated,
mm,
you
mm.
know? And accepting we're human, we're messy.
Yeah,
It is messy. It
yeah,
is messy. There is no safe, clean way to do this because I like to believe if there was, we'd all be doing it.
yeah.
Human nature, nurture. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think because I've realized we've been talking for quite a while, um, I guess is there any kind of one resource? I mean, I know there's lots of tools, materials out there, but is there something that maybe stands out for you that you would point people towards?
There's something which I've come across recently, and I really like it because it's useful and it's simple, but
Hmm.
it works. It communicates complexity and it works in a complex process, but it communicates all that really simply. And I think it's a sort of toolkit that anybody working in place could actually kind of just adopt now. And that's something called Design for Belonging.
Mm-hmm.
It's a framework to support um, to build greater belonging in place and kind of reduce that othering or isolation of people in a community of place setting. It's been tried and tested in various different contexts, and I think it wraps it up so neatly as a tool that can be used straight away. That's the one thing I think I might point, or I'd want to point people towards as a first step into
Yeah.
thinking differently about their practice and differently about how they go in and start to work with their neighbourhoods or to work with their communities of place.
I think that's really critical. The local,
Yeah,
the intimate, the familiar, which often you don't see because it's so familiar, or you have a particular perspective. What I really like about it is it's just even in the title,
yeah,
design for belonging. We've often talked about placemaking as belonging and disbelonging.
mm,
And I think framing it within places of belonging, it really, really shifts
it
almost
does.
the intention.
Yeah,
Um, I think following on from that, which may seem a bit of a outside the field of placemaking, I would point people towards the Crisis Prevention Institute's Trauma Informed Care for Educators. I think for a number of reasons, it's been developed in collaboration with the National Centre for Trauma Informed Care. What I think is important about it is trauma informed, trauma aware. It feels that this isn't something that is commonly understood.
mm,
So I feel there's a real important need for something that, like you were saying with the design for belonging, it's not a one-stop shop. There is no
mm,
checklist, there is no whatever, but this is quite a good foundational, relatively short document to raise awareness of trauma-informed
mm.
care and approach. The reason I think for educators, because of this shift about how much we need this approach maybe to be more central, really affecting change starts early.
Yeah,
It starts in the young, and we know from experience, from reading, that a lot of trauma starts when you're
mm,
young. I think those that work with young people, work within education, they are also frontline practitioners.
mm,
And I feel if we can also, as part of looking at schools or places of education where young people spend most of their time, these places, I think if we can begin to bring that into these places and really use them to develop that awareness of belonging, of how trauma operates, of the lens it can create, not just for the young people, but also for the educators.
Yeah.
You know, you can be in a situation where it might seem initially this is about you asked a young person to do something, they're not doing it, so suddenly there's a tension that could erupt when actually that young person isn't even in that conversation anymore.
Mm.
They're in a level of survival,
Mm.
you know, so they're thinking, and you can see then if that challenges the teacher and if the teacher isn't aware, you can see how these situations can, you know, kind of grow,
Yeah.
become quite negative and dangerous and can be hard to pull back from. So I think in that sense, I think it's a really good foundational intro, whether you're in education or not.
Mm.
And I think in terms of within, say, maybe placemaking itself, we know a lot of practices also involve education. So for me, education, it's not just about children and young people.
It's just struck me. I've read so many cultural master plans and planning applications that talk about placemaking as touching where people live, work, and play, but it's also where people learn, where
Yeah,
they work and where they play. So that you know, we
yeah.
do spend a lot of time at school. You're absolutely right. Just even on that level, placemaking, there's a gap.
And even if we're talking about, you know, historical practices of othering,
Yeah,
that becomes learnt behavior.
it does. Yeah.
You know, I know growing up in Northern Ireland, I was very lucky. I had opportunities to interact with different people. But if at that time 90% were living in either
Mm.
or, and let's say as a child, and you only have your community or your adult, your your guardian or parent's perspective, and they're telling you this is how it is, you know, I think there's an awful, a huge importance for learning and education within the practice of placemaking.
I think on that note, we've been speaking now for nearly an hour, so we should probably stop. That's quite short for us. But on that note of education, though, one of the resources I would point people towards would be your own resources for education and around place and the SDGs. We have to give a shout out to that because it's just inspiring and exemplary work.
Oh, yeah. You're very generous. I think some of the young learners we work with, because they're right bang in the middle of puberty, are like, oh, what am I? But it is actually very fulfilling as well because at the end of the year, when they sing song back to you, we know it's the system, da, 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 and you kind of go, my
My
work is
work
done.
here is done. Fab. It's been
Excellent.
lovely, Anita.
Yeah, you too. Take care, and I look forward to the next ones in the series.
Indeed.
Very
See you
excited.
soon.
Bye.
Bye.